Really early years, childhood experience. You're amazingly close, and yes, family, and we generally mean it when it's a short family, 'cause over 10 years, we're going to have a big family, and one sentence on the royal website shattered the usual silence. Explanation. Just a line of formal announcement will be made at 6 p.m. For a monarchy that never moves without choreography, it felt like a rupture. No subtle leaks to detinue trusted journalists, no advanced whispers through palisades, just a timestamp, and that alone sent shockwaves through the royal watching world. No one needed more than that to know something was wrong. The absence of detail was the alarm. Journalists scrambled, phones rang with questions no one could answer. Newsrooms stretched airtime guessing at possibilities. Theories surged, some absurd, others disturbingly believable. Health crisis, a sudden abdication, was someone forced out or stepping into power. The vacuum of information only deepened the tension, and this wasn't media noise. Even seasoned royal insiders were reportedly left in the dark. There were no pre-briefings, no talking points. If this was orchestrated, it had bypassed the usual gatekeepers. That alone raised the stakes, because in the monarchy, silence without structure is rarely harmless. Then came the shift, quiet at first, but unmistakable. All eyes turned to William and Kate. They'd skipped a scheduled appearance earlier in the day, an absence now impossible to ignore. If this announcement was coming from the king or queen, they would be the ones speaking. But they weren't, and the timing felt too deliberate to be random. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. The mood had changed across the country. The weight turned solemn. People weren't expecting gossip. They were bracing for something deeper, something that could redefine what the monarchy stood for. It wasn't the announcement that unsettled people, it was the silence behind it. And when the clock struck 6, the royal script was rewritten by two unexpected voices. When the screen lit up, it wasn't Charles or Camilla. It was William and Kate alone. There was no throne behind them, no glittering banners, no ceremonial guard standing off camera waiting to be acknowledged. Just the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in a quiet room that looked more like a private office than a royal stage. And yet in the stillness, they commanded more power than any crown could offer. For the first time in recent memory, the royal message came not from the reigning monarch or his consort, but from the heirs, speaking not as ornaments of tradition but as leaders in their own right. William began. There was no elaborate reading, no homage to lineage or legacy. He spoke with clarity, conviction, and a kind of emotional steadiness that made each word land harder. The monarchy is not just a symbol, it's a responsibility. That one sentence hit like a quiet reckoning. It wasn't a rebellion, but it was certainly a redirection. And for those listening closely, it was clear that this wasn't just a personal statement. It was a public shift in philosophy. Kate followed without pause. Her voice wasn't soft, but it wasn't sharp either. It was deliberate, controlled. Her words walked a line between grace and urgency. This isn't about tradition, she said. It's about trust. And just like that, centuries of ritual were reduced to something deeper, something modern. The message wasn't about who wore the crown, it was about who could be trusted to carry the weight of it. Not because of bloodline, but because of purpose. There were no royal advisors hovering in the background, no family photographs, nothing to suggest the approval or endorsement of King Charles or Queen Camilla. William and Kate were alone, and yet they stood for something bigger than themselves. Their appearance felt less like a broadcast and more like a declaration. The old way was no longer the only way. It wasn't a rejection of the monarchy, but a redefinition of its role in the world. Their tone wasn't angry or emotional. It was steady, grounded, as though they had prepared for this moment. Not in secrecy, but in silence, waiting for the right time to step forward with a message, not of division but of clarity. They weren't demanding loyalty, they were offering transparency. And in a monarchy built on myth that made it revolutionary. Their words didn't echo through marble halls or stained glass windows. They landed in living rooms, phones, and hearts. It didn't feel rehearsed. It felt chosen, and as they concluded their message, the tension that had built since that morning didn't dissipate. It shifted into something far more significant than an announcement. And then came the bombshell that would change everything: the Diana Initiative. Kate wasn't honoring the past, she was reclaiming it when she stepped forward and introduced the Diana Initiative. It wasn't framed as a tribute. It was a correction, a course realignment, a statement that the legacy of Princess Diana would no longer be confined to flowers at Kensington or archived memories. Replayed each August was about restoring a voice that had been softened, reshaping a presence that had been pushed aside, and taking back a narrative that had been diluted by time, scandal, and silence. But this time Diana's mission wouldn't rely on symbolic gestures. It would move with intent. The Diana Initiative, designed as a global nonprofit, its foundation rooted in the values that made Diana so beloved: compassion for the marginalized, radical transparency in a world of controlled appearances, and a relentless drive to serve people over protocol. This wasn't a passion project disguised as charity, it was a strategy, and Kate wasn't simply the founder. She was the engine. From the moment it was announced, it became clear she wasn't lending her name, she was giving it her full presence. There would be no red carpets or press-controlled events where royals wave and leave. Kate made it known she would personally visit shelters, meet with underserved families, listen to survivors and advocates, face to face, not in staged photo ops but in quiet, unpublicized conversations that often weren't meant for headlines at all. She wasn't aiming to be admired, she was determined to be useful. The public didn't miss the significance. The initiative wasn't just launched, it was felt. It carried echoes of Diana's hands-on approach, but this time with structure, reach, and long-term plans. It gave the people something they hadn't seen from the royal family in years. A cause that transcended performance. Kate wasn't filling Diana's shoes. She was carving a new path from Diana's spirit. A continuation of grace, empathy, and action shaped for a new generation. For those who still remember Diana's quiet battles against the institution, against the constraints of her role, this felt like a long overdue redemption arc. But the difference was power. Kate wasn't fighting from the margins. She was launching this initiative from within the heart of the monarchy. And that's what made it transformative. Diana had once used kindness as resistance. Kate was using it as leadership. Support came fast. Social media trended with phrases like "People's Queen," resurrected from the memory of Diana, and now applied without hesitation to Kate. It wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. The people saw someone who wasn't waiting to be queen to start leading, someone who chose to carry the weight of responsibility before it was officially handed over, and perhaps most powerfully, someone who reminded them what service should look like. But not everyone welcomed this tribute, especially not the queen consort. The public roared with approval. The palace responded with silence. The Diana Initiative struck a chord across the country, across continents. The response was electric. Social media lit up with praise. Global outlets carried the story with headlines that crowned Kate, not with jewels but with something far more powerful: public trust. Within hours, the phrase "the people's queen" began trending, echoing a title that once belonged to Diana, now felt reborn through her daughter-in-law. But inside the palace the air grew cold. There were no congratulatory statements from the king, no words of encouragement from Queen Camilla. The official accounts remained still, as if the announcement had never happened. It wasn't just silence, it was deliberate absence. Behind the scenes, insiders revealed the mood was anything but celebratory. Charles, blindsided, reportedly asked aides, "What did they do?" He wasn't angry, he was stunned. This wasn't the script he had expected. Just as he was beginning to settle into his reign, the spotlight had shifted, and not gently. The country wasn't looking to the monarch. It was looking to his son and daughter-in-law, who had just unveiled a plan more ambitious and emotionally resonant than any royal initiative in recent memory. But if Charles was shocked, Camilla was shaken. For years Camilla had fought to reshape her public image through charity work, quiet consistency, and the king's support. She had painstakingly moved from scandal to soft power. But with one announcement, one emotionally loaded homage to Diana, the public's gaze had turned again, not with animosity but with clarity. Kate's initiative wasn't a dig. It wasn't an attack, but it stirred something deeply personal in the queen consort. The very name Diana brought with it a weight she had worked for decades to escape. Inside palace walls there were murmurs of resentment, not just because Kate's actions had captured the public, but because they hadn't gone through the usual channels. There was no royal rubber stamp, no senior oversight. It was independent, decisive, and unstoppable. And that independence was unsettling. It highlighted the emotional divide between the institution and the people. It was meant to serve. Kate had stepped out with purpose, and the world embraced her. The palace meanwhile clung to protocol and said nothing. The silence grew louder by the day. As Kate visited clinics and shelters often without press, her sincerity became undeniable. Stories trickled out not through royal PR but from the mouths of those she met. Young mother, a grieving teenager, a shelter staffer. Each shared moments that echoed what Diana once represented: empathy, presence, authenticity. And each moment further isolated the palace's position. The contrast was stark. Kate's warmth stood in direct opposition to the institution's chill. There was no public fallout, no dramatic confrontation, but those closest to the crown knew what was unfolding. This wasn't just tension, it was the start of something deeper, a shift in loyalty, a quiet but unmistakable test of power, legacy, and public will. What began as silence soon became a quiet war behind closed doors. For centuries, the monarchy survived on spectacle: crowns, parades, ribbons, handshakes. But William and Kate weren't here to play a part in history. They were here to rewrite it. What unfolded after the Diana Initiative wasn't just a campaign. It was the unveiling of a new philosophy: relevance. Transparency, presence, three words that for most of the royal family had only existed in speeches. But for William and Kate, they became the foundation of a new kind of monarchy. One that didn't ask for reverence but earned respect through service. The message was unmistakable. No more polished ceremonies that meant little. No more waving from balconies while communities struggled, and no more symbolic gestures for photo ops. From now on, royal engagement would mean actual engagements. They weren't cutting ribbons. They were cutting through years of hollow tradition. And they weren't waiting for approval to do it. Their presence would be felt not in ballrooms but in battered shelters and overcrowded clinics. In classrooms still recovering from a broken system. In flood zones and mental health wards. They weren't performing royalty, they were redefining leadership. The shift was subtle but deliberate. Projects began rolling out that reflected the issues real people cared about. Not legacy topics but living ones: climate resilience, adolescent mental health, maternal safety, early education, equity. Each initiative wasn't just a gesture. It came with planning, partnership, and most importantly, accountability. Meetings weren't press events. They were strategy sessions. Field visits weren't scheduled to be seen. They were opportunities to learn, to listen, and to act. It quickly became clear that this wasn't about temporary popularity. This was about permanence. A recalibration of what the monarchy stood for and who it served. William and Kate weren't tearing down the crown. They were lifting it off its pedestal and placing it back within reach of the people. Very idea of royalty, once rooted in distance, was being replaced with something radically different. Accessibility. And it wasn't a rebellion. It was a correction. A long overdue admission that tradition without relevance was no longer sustainable. And while the public applauded this evolution, institution they belonged to recoiled, because change, no matter how well-intentioned, always disrupts power. William and Kate weren't just working around the old system. They were exposing its failings quietly, without confrontation, but with precision. And that was enough to unsettle those still clinging to legacy over leadership. But within the palace, this bold shift wasn't seen as vision. It was seen as betrayal. For William, it wasn't defiance. It was duty. He hadn't set out to upstage his father. He hadn't launched the Diana Initiative to provoke a shift in power. But when the public embraced the new model of monarchy, one built on purpose instead of pageantry, it became impossible to ignore the emotional cost. Playing out behind palace walls in private, King Charles reportedly struggled to make sense of it all. "The spotlight is gone," he confided to an aide. Not with anger, not even with bitterness, but with something more painful. Quiet sorrow after a lifetime of waiting to wear the crown, he now found himself eclipsed by a new kind of leadership that didn't need titles to command loyalty, and for William that realization cut deeper than anyone knew. He had braced for tension, he had expected disagreements. But the coldness, the absence of even a simple acknowledgement from his own father, that was never part of the plan. He hadn't betrayed the monarchy, he was trying to preserve what still mattered within it. But instead of unity, he was met with a wall of silence, and behind it a father saw his son's purpose as a personal loss. Camilla's reaction, however, wasn't quiet. While the king stood still, she moved to reassert control. Sources close to the palace revealed she urged that the Diana initiative be brought under official royal oversight. Folded into the established hierarchy, sanitized, and contained. Her concern wasn't just about visibility. It was about legacy, about not losing the ground. She had spent years earning Diana's name, revived and adored. Had once haunted her, now it threatened to overshadow her once again. But the palace's own advisors pushed back. The optics of seizing control over something born from compassion and grassroots service would be disastrous. It would look petty, controlling, even jealous. So they chose another path: passive resistance. No public statements, no coordinated support, just silence. Let it burn bright and fizzle out. That was the hope. Didn't William saw the tactic for what it was. And he didn't flinch. This isn't a discussion. He told an aide, it's a strategy. He wasn't asking for permission. He was building something that didn't need approval to matter. And in that conviction, he quietly severed himself from the old way of doing things, not to destroy it but to evolve it. The divide between father and son wasn't loud. There were no public disputes, no harsh words exchanged for cameras to catch, but the space between them widened all the same, not out of hatred but out of vision, one clinging to a reign built over decades, the other reaching for a future that could no longer wait. But behind the curtains, influence was shifting, and fast. No decree was signed, but the crown's gravity was moving. The shift didn't happen with a royal announcement or a public handover. It unfolded quietly but unmistakably. Eyes that once followed Charles and Camilla by default now turned instinctively toward William and Kate. News segments began opening with their names. Headlines highlighted their engagements. Editorials speculated not about what they might inherit, but what they were already reshaping. The monarchy, long defined by lineage, was beginning to follow something much more volatile. Public attention, and attention once lost is rarely reclaimed. Inside media circles, the calculus changed. Coverage of Charles's ceremonial duties, once seen as standard, began to feel flat, uninspired. Meanwhile, every move William and Kate made sparked conversation. When they showed up unannounced to a youth center, it trended for days. When they spoke on climate resilience, it drew global commentary. The shift wasn't superficial, it was foundational, and the palace press office noticed. More tellingly, royal aides began redirecting their energy. Briefings that once flowed through Buckingham started moving through Kensington. Young staffers sought assignments tied to the Diana initiative. Photographers no longer clustered outside Clarence House. They followed where the energy was, and that energy increasingly came from William and Kate's world. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't sabotage, it was realignment, a quiet recognition that credibility now carried more weight than protocol. Even junior royals felt the change. Those with causes of their own began gravitating toward the Diana initiative. Not for visibility but for purpose. Its structure wasn't just modern, it was magnetic. It offered a blueprint for how royalty could remain relevant without abandoning its values. It wasn't about crowns or castles, it was about action, sincerity, and consequence. And in a world where institutions are under constant scrutiny, that kind of authenticity was priceless. The unspoken truth became harder to ignore. William and Kate weren't waiting to be crowned. They were already leading, not from above but from beside. Their influence wasn't inherited. It was earned, and doing so, they rewrote the rules. For the first time in decades, royal influence was being measured. Seniority but by impact. And the balance of power was shifting in plain sight. But Kate's revolution didn't stop at strategy. It reached straight into the hearts of those suffering in silence. When the cameras stopped rolling and the headlines faded, she was still there, sitting across from survivors. students grieving parents and exhausted healthcare workers. This wasn't performance, it was presence. The Diana Initiative wasn't just a name stamped onto a foundation. It was a living, breathing promise to transform royal engagement into something that mattered. Kate made sure of it. One of the actions under the initiative was the creation of a national network of mental health support services aimed at reaching children and teens struggling with trauma and grief. It wasn't inspired by trends, it was born from memory, from the silence William and Harry were once forced to endure after their mother's death, from the pain Kate had witnessed up close, and from the belief that no child should navigate that kind of darkness alone. But the work didn't end with public policy. Behind palace doors, Kate quietly led sessions with experts in maternal health, not as a figurehead but as a facilitator. Survivors, doctors, midwives, advocates, no cameras, no press releases, just voices that had been ignored for too long. She listened to everyone, and in those sessions, a pattern emerged, one that revealed systemic neglect, racial bias, and dangerous gaps in care. Kate didn't write a speech. She took notes. The solutions being shaped were not driven by optics. They were driven by people. At the same time, William was dismantling another piece of the old structure. He began attending climate resilience forums not as a keynote speaker, not as a guest of honor, but as a participant. No special seating, no grand introductions, just a notebook, a name tag, and a commitment to listen. In one session, a child from a flood-ravaged community asked him directly, "Are you here to help or just be seen?" And William's reply, "To help, and if I fail, tell me." That clip, filmed on a volunteer's phone, went viral within hours. It wasn't the exposure that mattered, it was the humility, the authenticity, the absence of pretense. These weren't isolated acts. They were signals. Real people were beginning to share their stories. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. A teenager at a shelter said, "She didn't talk like a royal. She talked like someone who understood." A young mother added, "There were no cameras, but she still came." These voices, scattered across the country, began painting a picture. The palace could no longer control. A monarchy that was no longer performing royalty, but embodying responsibility. Was no press campaign to amplify it. No choreographed rollout, but the effect was undeniable. The Diana Initiative wasn't functioning as a symbolic tribute. It was functioning as a movement, one that was rewiring how the public saw service leadership and empathy at the highest level. And still, the quiet revolution was only just beginning to echo beyond the UK. What began as a single announcement evolved into something far more seismic. The Diana Initiative, once viewed as a heartfelt tribute, now operated like a blueprint for the monarchy's future. And with it came an unprecedented standard for transparency. Every donation, every partnership, every decision, documented, audited, and made available to the public. Not as a symbolic gesture, but as a promise. Kate made it clear from the beginning: trust must be earned, not inherited. The days of blind reverence were over, and in their place, more durable was being built: accountability. This new approach quickly expanded beyond the UK. What started as a domestic mission became a global collaboration, from mental health clinics in Canada to maternal care initiatives in Southeast Asia. The Diana Initiative formed alliances with international US government bodies and grassroots leaders. But unlike traditional royal patronage, these partnerships weren't ceremonial. William and Kate didn't just put their names on causes. They showed up in person on the ground, and people noticed. Not just the public, but those inside the firm. Younger royal, once unsure of their place in an aging institution, began seeking out the Kensington team, not for protocol but for purpose. They wanted to understand how this new model worked, why it resonated, and how they could contribute without being swallowed by tradition. For the first time in years, the monarch wasn't just reacting to public pressure, it was evolving alongside it. Quietly, steadily, and with intent. And while no official titles were shifted, something far more powerful occurred. The court of public opinion rendered its verdict. William and Kate weren't waiting for a coronation to be seen as future. They were the future because they led not with superiority but with sincerity. Not with entitlement, but with empathy. Their influence didn't come from bloodlines, it came from actions. And those actions were beginning to define the entire tone of the modern monarchy. In palace halls still governed by hierarchy, it might not have seemed like a revolution, but outside those walls something undeniable was happening. The monarchy was no longer a relic,
polished for ceremonial display. It was becoming something real, responsive, and human, not by accident and certainly not by order, but by choice, by connection, by a willingness to listen before leading. In one quiet moment, they didn't just make history, they redefined what royalty means in the 21st century. Drop your thoughts in the comments section and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the